I'm Miguel Martinez Lucio. I'm at the University of Manchester, and I'm involved in the Fairness at Work group within the Manchester Business School. And I'm doing various projects, but this particular project, which is funded by the Leverhulme Trust, is with Heather Connolly and with Stefani Marino. And what we've done is we're looking at questions of racism and social exclusion in terms of immigration in the Netherlands, Britain, and Spain. And we're looking at the way in which trade unions are responding to these issues across these three countries. We've done research in similar areas before individually, but we've now developed a new joint project which involves approximately 150 to 160 interviews and tries to understand the different ways in which questions of immigration and questions of racism are understood across those countries in terms of the trade union movement in particular. Within each country there are very different understandings of the issues. Within Britain there is a history of equality politics starting in the 70s and 80s, which has been researched by various individuals. And what we're beginning to find is that there's a sensitivity to these types of issues. So for example, there's a history of black worker sections. Although in terms of newly arrived migrants, be they from Poland or from other areas of the world, they don't always obviously connect into the more traditional mainstream aspects of trade union work. The problem the British labour movement finds is it doesn't have the level of subsidy or support or role from the state which exists in other contexts. So in Spain, which has had very little immigration in the 70s and 80s, and suddenly has a very broad experience of immigration compressed into 10 years. The Spanish trade union movement has developed advisory centers, both the UGT and the CCOO, amongst others, such that in every town or city in Spain, in particular, there are advisory centers directed towards immigrants. And these have been very kind of successful in supplying basic labor market information and acting as a bridgehead into the union. There is an element of state funding and state support in certain regions and certain autonomous states in terms of this. So the link with the state is very, very important in this respect. So what we're finding is there's very different responses. At the same time, in terms of issues such as internal organization of immigrants within the unions, historically this is very different to that in Britain, where there has been a certain amount of sensitivity towards certain types of sections or autonomous organization. It depends on the union. As a consequence of this, understandings of how you involve immigrants within class politics varies tremendously. In fact, in the case of Spain, although the level of response has been actually quite interesting and has been documented by a range of research as being quite extensive, there's sensitivity to what extent there should be self-organization within the unions. In the Dutch case, we find that there's been historically greater multiculturalism, historically a greater degree of sensitivity and a high level of welfare intervention. And the Dutch trade unions have developed a discourse of diversity and equality and renovated much of its imagery in relationship to newly arrived immigrants. But having said that, like Britain, has a long history of immigration. One of the challenges in the Dutch model has been in the last 5-10 years is how do you connect with workers in cleaning or in agriculture that may fall in the periphery of the labour market, and not that it's a peripheral type of work by any means. And as a consequence of that, the Dutch model's kind of institutionalist or institutionalized approach has had to renew itself. So what we found within the Netherlands has been quite an interesting engagement with, for example, organizing, such that American organizers have played a role in a sense, assisting the Dutch movement in developing organizing campaigns, especially in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. And these kinds of campaigns have been directed at kind of the question of living wages. So the Dutch have been looking over to London, where there's a living wage campaign. They've been learning through the SEIU, the American trade union movement, or part of the American trade union movement in terms of how to organize. And there's been a kind of process of organizational learning and change. How that sits with the traditional Dutch model, which might be more institutionalized and more partnership in approach, is a challenge. So one of the things we've been able to do in this project is actually show quite interestingly that there are different trade union responses and different types of approaches, but at the same time within each country there are different positives but also different challenges that exist. In Britain, regardless of the amount of funding that is provided through the Union Learning Fund for the British trade union movement, I mean, funding for specific types of projects is relatively low, and state support and state inclusion is low. In terms of Spain, to summarize, it's been relatively higher and there's a broader class discourse, but in terms of direct connection, that's a bit more challenging. Depends on the union you talk to. And in the Netherlands, there's, in a sense, these issues have forced a kind of internal reflection as to how to renew the labour movement, although obviously the welfare state in the Netherlands captures many workers in many ways, but the question is how you reach those more kind of disorganized parts of the working class. In terms of decent work, I think there are various lessons. Two things spring to mind. The first is that it's how institutions or trade unions or autonomous worker bodies, whatever, or migrant organizations for that matter, would address some of the real challenges in the immediate stages of labor market inclusion. Questions of language, skills in terms of advice, actually providing a portfolio of basic skills in order to operate autonomously within the labor market is very, very challenging, because it's not just about labor standards and decency within the workplace and a certain type of employer culture. It's actually also about a longer term relationship with the workforce in terms of basic skills, learning, confidence, and broader education, and also linking into the autonomous bodies in those communities. One of the things our research really, I think, ends up calling for is a more serious strategic tie-up with social organizations, which obviously is very important. So I think the first thing is identifying those first stages. The second thing, I think, is that while there is a lot of proactive strategies, I think increasingly we're concerned with the manner in which the voice of trade union, or the voice of immigrant workers or black and minority ethnic workers, which is not always the same thing, is included. And there's very different ways in which we do this. So it's not just about a kind of template of decency or a template of standards or management training, but it's also about the way in which we build into the agenda of decency and of decent work, of fairness, a more direct, democratic and participative process. And in previous projects, in one project with Robert Perret, we actually were also concerned that there sometimes is a democratic deficit, because overall the great risk might be that you end up basically delivering services, but not thinking how you deliver these services, who delivers these services, and with whom you deliver these services, you know. And that raises some kind of issues about participation. And I think without a proactive approach to participation and regulation and servicing and services and decency can become slightly disconnected, and a series of kind of, not undemocratic templates, but an agenda that isn't grounded in any kind of popular context.